Hello, my name is Anita Prest, and I live on the territories of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples. I teach at the University of Victoria in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada.
My name is Scott Goble, and I live, work, and play in Vancouver, British Columbia, on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I teach at the University of British Columbia.
We're honored to have the opportunity to speak to you today. The title of our presentation is The Promise of Indigenous Research Methodologies and Methods for Music Education Practice.
Not only are the worldviews of Indigenous peoples coming to be recognized as more ecologically beneficent than those grounded in European cultures, it's becoming evident that research methods rooted in Indigenous worldviews may hold greater potential for addressing issues of equity and diversity, the theme of this year's ISME conference, than other approaches to social research undertaken in music education. While the worldviews of different Indigenous peoples collectively prioritize the unity and interdependence of the physical and spiritual domains within which all beings live together, local communities' respective ways of being and knowing are relatively unique.
Accordingly, Indigenous scholars have affirmed that research involving Indigenous peoples must involve specific methods extending from local Indigenous ways of being and knowing, following the protocols of the particular people involved in the study in order for the research to be regarded as credible and valid in the views of those communities. In emphasizing these procedures, Indigenous peoples ensure that the research contributes to community resurgence, regardless of whether they complete the investigation on their own or in partnership with non-Indigenous researchers. In this paper, we assert that centering Indigenous knowledges, aspirations, and processes at the heart of music education research with Indigenous communities will make it possible for researchers to decolonize and indigenize music education scholarship.
Given that there are multiple understandings of the terms decolonization and indigenization across the globe as influenced by local historical events, current power structures, and individual awareness, we emphasize that our perspective is rooted in our location, a specific settler colonial context, British Columbia, Canada, and that we are non-Indigenous researchers of European descent dedicated to ongoing learning on this topic. As part of our learning, today we wish to provoke fruitful discussion at an international level so that, together as a music education community, we can determine how we might work to decolonize the ways in which we conduct music education research in our individual contexts. We're conscious that some listeners may regard as problematic the very notion of white settlers speaking on this issue, but the Indigenous elders, culture workers, culture bearers with whom we have worked have urged us to do so, reminding us that it is our responsibility, not theirs, to engage in this conversation.
In our view, music education researchers have seldom embraced the soundness of Indigenous research approaches, perhaps because most have historically not even considered them as meriting their attention. Still, while some have studied the relationship between mainstream music education and Indigenous performing arts traditions, only a few have adopted Indigenous approaches and self-reflexively examined their efforts. This reluctance has perpetuated unexamined colonial beliefs and practices in research that foster injustice and inequality, both locally and globally. Inequality, states Cruikshank, is maintained and reproduced through manipulation of symbols and by the power to control representations that allows one sector of society to control the images and the public identities of others without their input. In order to decolonize music education research, it will be important to use a critical reflexive lens that acknowledges the politics of representation within Indigenous research.
We begin this paper by describing how the politics of representation within music education research remains unexamined. Indeed, the power to control representations manifests itself in subtle ways through bias, for example, the assumption that Indigenous research methodologies and methods are simply other varieties of qualitative research, and more overtly, as in the absence of peer reviewers on music education journal editorial boards who are Indigenous scholars, or at the very least have expertise in Indigenous research methodologies, and in music education journal policies that do not accept for review manuscripts reporting on studies using community-based research approaches.
We then explain the differences between qualitative and Indigenous research paradigms and show how music education journals that exclude community-based research approaches undermine the very ethics of conducting research with Indigenous communities. Citing as exemplars a recent study in which we employed sharing circles and a current study using conference, we describe some of the Indigenous research methods and protocols we have employed under the guidance of Indigenous partners. We submit that these ways of creating knowledge may be ways to prioritize Indigenous people's aspirations, while also contributing to ecological approaches and new knowledge in music education. In doing this work, we strive to act in accordance with Smith's directive that decolonization must offer a language of possibility, a way out of colonialism.
Now we'd like to talk about distinctions between qualitative and Indigenous methodologies. As recently as 2018, scholars of research methodology have generally subsumed Indigenous methodologies under the umbrella of qualitative research. Kovacs affirms that some qualitative research methodologies, such as feminist approaches, participatory action research, narrative inquiry, autoethnography, these align with Indigenous methodologies in that they focus on relationships. They value both process and content, and they entail self-reflexivity. Recognition of this congruence matters, she states, because it provides common ground for Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers to understand each other. However, for Archibald, Batiste, Bishop, Dei, Grande, Kovacs, and Wilson, Indigenous methodologies cannot be subsumed under the umbrella of qualitative methodology for 4 reasons. 1, they are driven by Indigenous methodology, by Indigenous epistemologies and axiologies, and they're consistent with them. 2, they are decolonizing in intent. 3, they are critical in ways that diverge from critical theory. And 4, the conception of trustworthiness in which they are rooted differs from that generally held in qualitative research. We will consider each of these differences in turn.
Reason 1. Indigenous methodologies are driven by and consistent with Indigenous epistemologies and axiologies. Wilson asserts that studies using Indigenous research methodologies are internally sound because the cosmology, worldview, epistemology, and ethical beliefs of the particular people involved in the research inform all aspects of the research process. These Indigenous epistemological frameworks, plus the consistency between methodology and the frameworks, it is that makes Indigenous research methodologies distinct from Western qualitative approaches. Rooted in these frameworks are ethical principles such as reciprocity, relationality, respect, relevance, reverence, and responsibility. Marker notes that although ethical principles are embedded in many forms of qualitative research, including those concerning themes of collaboration, community, and power differentials in relationships with informants, an Indigenous methodology must go beyond this and connect the inquirer to an ancient sense of the journey for knowledge.
Reason 2, Indigenous methodologies are decolonizing in intent. Wilson, Batiste, Bishop, and other Indigenous researchers have asserted that all research in and with Indigenous communities should benefit Indigenous communities and cultures, not just researchers, their educational institutions, or Canadian society. This is a priority because, until recently, much research concerning Indigenous peoples has been exploitive and harmful to participants and their communities. Indigenous research is undertaken with the intention that every step of the research process supports Indigenous self-determination, capacity building, and well-being. As such, researchers who use Indigenous methods are relationally accountable to the community members with whom they work. They are also accountable to the new knowledge that they co-create in relationship and the readers of an audience to whom they present this new knowledge.
Reason 3, Indigenous methodologies are critical, but diverge from critical theory. Critical theory, informed by and which originated in the writings of the Frankfurt School during the European interwar period, is concerned with human liberation, autonomy, and transformation, in which democracy and democratic ideals play a central role. As such, its goals appear somewhat in alignment with Indigenous aspiration for self-determination. However, several Indigenous scholars have drawn distinctions between critical theory and Indigenous paradigms. In discussing critical pedagogy, an extension of critical theory specifically applied to the field of education, Grande explains, revolutionary critical pedagogy remains rooted in the Western paradigm and therefore is in tension with Indigenous knowledge and praxis. The root constructs of democratization, subjectivity, and property are all defined through Western frames of reference that presume the individual as the primary subject of rights and social status. For Grande, Indigenous paradigms prioritize community and relationships over the liberated self. Sovereignty from this perspective is not linked to individual power, but to relationships with land, humans, and non-humans.
Within the field of music education, Hess has noted that the cognitive focus of critical reflection may unwittingly negate other ways of knowing, and that critical educators may marginalize Indigenous knowledge or themes or problems important to communities when implementing critical pedagogies. Cruikshank concurs, explaining that critical theorists, in their analyses of the incorporation of colonial influences, commodification of culture, or perceived inventions of tradition, often erase the ways Indigenous peoples consider or confer meaning on circumstances that confront them, having the effect of a double erasure of agency, first by colonial forces, then by post-colonial analyses.
Thus, it is vital that non-Indigenous music education researchers investigating Indigenous ways of knowing and being continuously engage in self-reflexivity throughout the research process, and thereby consistently take note of whether they are operating within or contributing to colonial processes. With respect to this point, we acknowledge and extend our gratitude to non-Indigenous music education scholars Lorianne Dolph, Alexis Callio, and Bridie Lee Bartlett, Dawn Bennett, Ann Power, and Naomi Sunderland, who have chronicled their experiences when conducting research with Indigenous communities, sharing their reflections and the guiding principles that have assisted them in their ongoing learning.
Reason 4. Indigenous methodologies have unique conceptions of trustworthiness. Absalon has asserted that, from Indigenous perspectives, research can be regarded as trustworthy only when researchers respect the genealogy of knowledge associated with their learning. Demonstrating respect involves doing several things: publicly acknowledging our teachers and where our knowledge comes from, using ceremonies or protocols to formally recognize the relationship they hold with new knowledge and with research participants, following processes outlined by the specific Indigenous people on whose behalf they conduct research, obtaining regular feedback from participants, reporting findings in a storied format, engaging in ongoing reciprocity with the Indigenous community, and locating themselves when reporting findings so that readers can form their own judgments about researchers' credibility and authority to search and write.
Research procedures that meet Indigenous people's definition of trustworthiness require much time to develop, as all partners must first build relationships prior to reaching consensus on process. For more than 15 years, Canadian health researchers and Indigenous community members have employed a research framework entitled Community-Based Participatory Research, or CBPR, that includes all the steps essential to Indigenous research delineated by Absalon, and have thereby contributed to efforts to decolonize the university researcher-Indigenous community relationship. We describe this framework in detail below because it is also applicable to music education research with Indigenous communities.
Community-based participatory research, or CBPR, is a process by which decision-making power and ownership are shared between the researcher and the community involved, bidirectional research capacity and co-learning are promoted, and new knowledge is co-created and disseminated in a manner that is mutually beneficial for those involved. Indigenous communities have identified CBPR as a way to address the colonial legacy of research on Indigenous communities, requiring researchers to inform themselves about the harmful legacies of historical and ongoing colonial structures and policies, and to appreciate the diversity of Indigenous peoples by learning the unique modes of being in the specific Indigenous communities with which they choose to work, prior to approaching them. When conceiving a study, It is crucial that researchers and Indigenous partners establish Indigenous advisory boards and steering committees which guide all research activities throughout the research cycle, because such groups play an important role in legitimizing CBPR in Indigenous communities, also adding stability and coherence to the research process.
In recent years, Indigenous scholars have critiqued university human research ethics boards, or REBs, and granting agencies minimal efforts to change their policies to reflect Indigenous worldviews and values. They have identified a range of issues, including individualized rather than collective forms of consent, lack of REB members' expertise in research with Indigenous communities, universalist notions of ethics, and formalism. Indigenous scholars and community members have worked tirelessly with Canadian and national funding agencies to develop more culturally appropriate guidelines for university researchers to follow when conducting research with Indigenous communities and when receiving federal funding for these purposes. Consequently, REB policies and granting agencies' guidelines have required, since 2018, substantial community engagement in Indigenous research to ensure that Indigenous conceptions of ethical conduct guide the research. Researchers are obliged to co-create memoranda of understanding with Indigenous communities that address issues of privacy, intellectual property, data custody, and secondary use of data. Moreover, federal granting agencies strongly recommend that researchers and communities apply a collaborative and participatory approach as appropriate to the nature of the research and the level of ongoing engagement desired by the community.
Thus, music education scholars in Canada must engage in discussion with Indigenous community members prior to and while conducting research with them. Other countries, including New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, have adopted similar research ethics and funding policies. Yet, a meta-analysis of Indigenous research has noted a gap between the research processes required by these guidelines and those recognized as valid by academic publications. Dion and collaborators say this: gatekeepers, like article reviewers and journal editors, should recognize the value of participatory research that includes Indigenous perspectives, and university policies should recognize epistemological and methodological biases in mainstream disciplinary publications.
Accordingly, it's essential that music education journal editors are conversant with these Indigenous research guidelines and policies, and that Indigenous scholars, or at the very least, those who have expertise in Indigenous research methodologies, serve as peer reviewers. It is also vital that journal editors, in addition to accepting for review manuscripts reporting on studies that use quantitative and qualitative methodologies, also review those reporting on studies with Indigenous communities that have used community-based research approaches. In this way alone can the field of music education truly decolonize the full spectrum of the research process, from conception of the study to knowledge dissemination.
In our time remaining, we would like to describe briefly the evolution of our ongoing journey to engage in music education research with Indigenous partners. Over the course of 3 federally funded studies conducted since 2016, we have studied the decolonization and indigenization of music classes in British Columbia public schools. In our first study, we sought examples of how rural music educators and local Indigenous community members had collaborated to embed local Indigenous knowledge into music classes. Our intent was to identify ways in which music educators had already embedded Indigenous knowledge in their classes following the new BC curriculum guidelines. We obtained permissions from and followed the protocols of the 13 First Nations on whose territories we interviewed participants, also familiarizing ourselves with their colonial histories, values, worldviews, and aspirations. However, we did not seek input from members of the Indigenous communities on whose territories we completed the study, apart from the culture bearers and culture workers directly involved.
Although we learned much about Indigenous research, that is, inquiry undertaken by Indigenous people and settler allies, informed by Indigenous philosophies, theories, and methods, it was only when we began to conceptualize our second study in 2018 that we actively partnered with an urban Indigenous community organization, the Victoria Native Friendship Center, or VNFC. Our research partners included Ron Rice, the executive director, and Lisa Mercure, culture and traditions coordinator, plus Dr. Adam Kahn from the University of Victoria. For the second study, which focused on the problematics of developing Indigenous vocal music resources for uses in school, we co-designed the research questions and co-organized 4 gatherings or sharing circles. Ron and Lisa facilitated the sharing circles, helping us to work with elders and follow local protocols. We describe these methods in depth in the forthcoming ISME Policy Commission proceedings, which will be uploaded on the ISME website later this month. Engaging with over 40 individuals from 19 First Nations and Métis Nations over the course of 4 sharing circles gave us a greater sense of the priorities of local urban Indigenous peoples. One of the tangible results to arise from these sharing circles was the establishment of an Indigenous Steering Committee comprised of individuals from Hulkaminam, Nehiyot, Dene, Haida, Gitxsan, Métis, and Mi'kmaq nations, which will guide our future activities.
For our third study, we're taking direction from several Indigenous and music education partner groups, including the Victoria Native Friendship Centre, the BC Ministry of Education Indigenous branch, the Indigenous departments of 2 school districts, Pacific Opera, Dr. Adam Kahn and Dr. Stephen Capaldo from the University of Victoria, and the BC Music Educators Association. Our joint goal is to stimulate meaningful dialogue across the province on locally derived solutions to embed Indigenous content, pedagogies, and worldviews in music classes by organizing a 2-day conference for approximately 220 people. We will invite music teachers and Indigenous leaders from all 60 British Columbia school districts who, along with culture bearers from each of the territories where the school districts are located, will engage in this dialogue. Following the example of Indigenous scholars who do health research with Indigenous communities and who have used conference as a research method when the number of people is too large for a single sharing circle, we will investigate the challenges, appropriate processes, and protocols for embedding Indigenous knowledge and worldviews through music in schools in each region of the province. During the conference, which we hope will take place in February 2022, we will follow local protocols. These will include inviting a local elder to give a territorial welcome, smudging, gathering and telling stories, drumming, singing, and storytelling from several First Nations, gifting to guests and elders, formal witnessing, and the creation of a new song for all participants.
We have begun a journey with Indigenous colleagues. Together, we are engaged in long-term research that uses CBPR processes and is underpinned by Indigenous paradigms, with the goal that all students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, will come to benefit mutually from the locally determined and culturally appropriate embedding of local cultural practices and Indigenous worldviews in music classes.
It is our hope that in using Indigenous methodologies and CBPR approaches, non-Indigenous music education researchers who do work with Indigenous communities will be able to contribute to Indigenous resurgence in a culturally appropriate way. It's also possible that if we in the music education profession foreground the worldviews expressed through the processes and protocols we are taught by our Indigenous partners, both in our research and in our practice, that is through reciprocity, relationality, respect, relevance, reverence, and responsibility, we may bring new knowledge to music education. In this way, we will avoid superficial, trendy, and commercialized responses to what we are gifted through the generosity and graciousness of the Indigenous peoples with whom we work. In foregrounding both local Indigenous worldviews and the interconnectedness of all inhabitants on the earth, we may, together as a profession, begin to decolonize and draw nearer to true equity in music education.
On behalf of the Indigenous peoples and teachers who have contributed to our research, and Scott and myself, I say Haichka, or thank you, to Dr. Susan O'Neill for giving us this opportunity to speak with you today.
Haichka.